Next up, I have a book for you that sometimes makes it onto the lists of the most, not the most popular, but the best English language novels of the 20th century. And I think there was one that Time put out, the best English language novel since 1921 or 1923. And there was 100 of them. They did a reviewer and critics list of the top 100, and then a sort of a reader's choice list. And the reader's choice list is horrible. It has books that no one really reads anymore on it, and like Ayn Rand's Ayn Rand stuff and things that are just, sorry, my personal opinion, not terribly great. And then of course, as you might expect, the reviewers and critics have a bit more of a sort of maybe a prognosticating sense of what's going to be more important. And this was on the reviewer and critics list and not the readers list, tellingly. It is, to save everyone some time, Appointment in Samarra by John O'Hara. John O'Hara might be best known today for his hundreds of short stories, which have been collected, all of which were originally printed in the New Yorker back in the mostly 30s, 40s, and 50s. This was written, I want to say, in 1934, if I'm not mistaken, originally published in 1934. So we're talking about sort of height of the Depression, and no relief coming from World War II yet. It's interesting to sort of keep in the back of your mind while I'm talking about what the book is talking about. So the last time I read anything by John O'Hara was Butterfield 8, which was a book that didn't really strike me much at the time, and whose plot I can only faintly remember. I also remember at the time watching the Elizabeth Taylor version of the film that came out. I think she played the prostitute who ends up getting murdered in sort of a film noir, crime noir situation. I don't remember a lot about it. And now, after having read this, Appointment in Samarra, I'm found in, I'm sort of in one of those positions in which I might want to go back and possibly reread it because I just loved it so much. There's something really incredibly understated and subtle at work in Appointment to Samarra that either wasn't around in Butterfield 8 or that I completely missed. And seeing as how I read it a long, long time ago, 15 years ago probably, I may have just very well missed it. That subtlety and understatedness sort of reminds me of what I encountered when I first read Richard Yates, especially Revolutionary Road. Stylistically, I think both share the hard, rough around the edges, workaday sort of writing that that those writers that Gore Vidal referred to as field and stream writers, with his usual sort of offhanded humor. I think he was especially talking about Hemingway, but I think we all know the kind of hard masculinist style that was popular at the time. At the same time, however, especially in this novel, there's a really deep, and also in the Gates, there's a really deep sense of wistfulness and tragedy. And I mean tragedy in the most historical sense of the word. While we don't see or hear any of the accoutrement of ancient Greek tragedy, no masks, no choruses, nothing like that, all of O'Hara's central characters are imbued with a heavy sense of hamartia, that we get the aching sense that something horrible will befall them because of a fatal flaw in their personality. And because of that, we almost cringe to think of of what will befall them, and to even read on, because we don't really exactly want to see what we know is going to happen to. In this sense, reading John O'Hara again turns the reader into sort of a vulgar rubbernecker, whose catharsis can only be supplied by seeing what the gods have in store for the main characters. And speaking of main characters, to wit, we have the simple enough case here of a man by the name of Julian English, who is a Cadillac salesman in the town of Gibbsville, Pennsylvania, which is the slightly fictionalized version of John O'Hara's own town of Pottsville, also in Pennsylvania. Julian's alcoholism is a byproduct of both the Prohibition, which is still active at this time, or was very recently active, might have been recently repealed. Byproduct of the Prohibition, and his resentment that immigrants, and especially Jews, he has a real abiding anti-Semitism, Julian does, about finding their way firmly into the middle class, into his middle class neighborhood. This alcoholism sort of hides some of his motivations, but it's clear from the beginning that his bigotry, his insensitivity, and his, well, downright racism and ethnocentrism play important parts in his internal psychological life. One of the 3 consecutive days during which the novel takes place, Julian commits 3 acts. On 3 consecutive days, he commits 3 acts, one each day. The first of which is tossing a drink, an alcoholic drink, in the face of a man named Harry Riley. Julian and Harry run in the same social circles. He's used to Harry telling these long-winded, what he thinks to be obnoxious, annoying stories about his personal life. He refers to him, again, with Julian's typical racist dismissive-ness, as having a Blarney sense of humor, because of course Harry Riley is of Irish ethnic descent. Making fun of him, referring to the fact that Irish people drink so much, which is pretty ironic coming from him. And he just really hates this guy, so he ends up throwing a drink in his face. However, Julian has no idea that Harry is actually a vitally important investor in Julian's Cadillac dealing branch of the business in Gibbsville. Over the next 2 days, some of the other 2 events aren't terribly important, but they do sort of additionally add on to the fall of Julian. We get glimpses of the crushing smallness of life in Gibbsville, the race to the top of the social ladder, the sort of claustrophobic small town assumptions about other people, about what they think, and about who they care about, and affairs that are being had. Carolyn, who is Julian's wife, remains by his side during this precipitous decline of his, but is still worried about how his reputation will redound to her. She starts off frustrated with Julian, but rightly begins to express concern for both his personal health and the way that her social calendar will be affected if he continues to showcase such erratic behavior. Nevertheless, Julian's reckless and careless behavior persists, ending in, as I hinted at earlier, what's almost bound to happen from the start if you're an attentive reader. Not going to suggest what that is. Read it yourself. The original title, by the way, like I said, I've never mentioned to Samarra. It's, to my knowledge, not a town in Pennsylvania. So what's going on with Appointment to Samarra? The original title was supposed to be the much more pedestrian the Infernal Grove. Not sure why he was thinking about that one, but instead of seeming oddly foreign and out of place for a small town, for a story about small town American life, Appointment in Samarra seems actually oddly appropriate. It comes from someone whose work engaged other parts of the world to a far greater degree than O'Hara's, and that person was W. Somerset Maugham. And specifically, one of his reworkings of an ancient Mesopotamian story about the appointment that death has with the servant of an ancient Baghdadi merchant. The merchant runs into the servant in the marketplace and recognizes her eyes. Apparently, death is a woman, at least in ancient Mesopotamia. With all due celerity, flees to the city of Samarra, where he thinks that death will never be able to find him. So the merchant gets curious. He's wondering, where are my groceries? Where is my servant? I'm going to go down to the souk, go down to the market and see what's going on with where all my stuff is and where my servant is. He runs into Death as well, and apparently recognizes her as well. And she says to him, I was astonished to see him in Baghdad, for I had an appointment with him tonight in Samarra. Appointment in Samarra by John O'Hara. A fabulous book. Go read it. Until next time.